The day the first bulldozer rolled onto my land, I was standing ankle-deep in icy river water, fly rod bent, line humming softly, thinking about nothing except trout and the steady breath of the current. That was the kind of place it was, quiet, hidden, 2 acres of low valley, ground tucked between pine-covered hills and a wide bend in the Clearwater River, the kind that swells every spring with snowmelt rolling down from the Rockies. My grandfather bought that land back in the late 70s when nobody wanted it. Half of it sat in a floodplain. Locals understood, but outsiders feared. To them, it looked like risk. To us, it was sacred. Respect the water, my grandfather used to say, and it'll respect you back. I inherited the land the same way he, devised with paperwork most people, never bothered to read. And one warning that mattered more than any survey marker: never fight the river. It always wins. So when I heard diesel engines echoing through the valley, I knew something was wrong. Heavy machinery didn't belong there. Neither did orange safety fencing, bright white stakes, or the sharp smell of disturbed earth. I climbed the slope from the riverbank and saw a fresh road being carved, straight through the lower meadow. At first I thought it was a mistake. County work, utility access, something temporary. Then I saw the sign: luxury living coming soon, Silver Crest Bend Estates, private community. My name wasn't on it, and the road cut straight through. Parcel D, the part of my land everyone liked to pretend didn't exist, because it flooded every few years. The land that absorbed overflow, the land that protected everything uphill from washing away. The land my grandfather warned me never to sell, never to build on, never to let anyone touch. I drove home and pulled the old steel file box from the closet, the one filled with brittle folders, handwritten notes, and deeds that smelled like dust and ink. Inside were original parcel maps, easement records, water flow agreements signed by neighbors who'd been dead for decades. And right there, exactly where I remembered, was the original survey. It showed the flood diversion dam upstream, the spillway gates, and the controlled overflow path that ran directly through my land. That dam was older than the houses being built uphill. Privately owned, maintained under a cooperative agreement that transferred with the land. Belonged to me. When I drove back that afternoon, the machines were still working. No permits posted, no notices. No one had knocked on my door. So I let them keep going. I called the county. They said the developer had approvals. I called Silvercrest Development Group. They said access issues were handled by the HOA. I contacted the HOA board.
They told me they had easement rights and suggested I review my paperwork carefully. So I did. Every page, every signature. They were wrong. But I didn't tell them. Construction moved fast, faster than it should have. Streets were raised, shallow foundations poured, drainage systems installed that assumed water would politely obey concrete. They filled natural channels that had carried runoff safely for generations. Decorative ponds were planted exactly where floodwater used to spread and slow down. The HOA president, Mark Ellison, stopped by once to brag about how their engineering firm had solved the floodplain problem. With modern solutions, I smiled and said nothing. By the end of the first year, 20 homes stood finished. By the end of the second 50, big homes. Expensive homes, all of them built on land that had never once stayed dry during a real spring thaw. They marketed river views and peaceful living. They never mentioned the dam. That spring came late and heavy. Snow stacked deep in the high country. Then the temperature jumped fast. The river rose the way it always did, slowly at first, then with purpose. I walked the old path to the control shed above the spillway. Boots sank into mud that smelled like memory. The gauges climbed. The locks sat untouched. The HOA sent newsletters about landscaping rules and parking violations. They fined a homeowner for leaving trash bins out overnight. They ignored the water. By the time the first upstream warning siren sounded, Silver Crest Bend was fully occupied. Kids played in yards where cattails once grew. Cars lined streets that used to carry overflow. I watched the river press against its banks. It wanted room. It always did. That afternoon, Mark Ellison arrived with 2 board members and a clipboard. He said their engineers had everything under control. He told me I needed to keep the spillway gates closed to prevent panic. He said it like a request. It wasn't. I told him I would follow the original land agreement, the one recorded decades before Silvercrest ever existed. He laughed and said they'd handle it legally. That night, rain fell on top of the melt. Not violent, just steady enough to tip the balance into inevitability. I slept well. At dawn, the gauge crossed the threshold my grandfather had marked in red ink. The point where holding water stopped being protection and started being destruction. I unlocked the shed, turned the wheel, opened the gates. The river didn't rage. It didn't explode. It simply went where it had always gone. Through my land, across the meadow, into the low basin where 57 homes sat like a misplaced dream. By mid-morning, water reached driveways. By noon, garages filled. By evening, streets turned into canals. HOA emergency emails flooded in. Then came the calls. Then the threats. I didn't answer.
I stood on high ground and watched the valley breathe away human confidence. When the water receded days later, it left behind silence and damage measured in millions, shifted foundations, blooming mold, cracked roads. Insurance adjusters arrived with tight faces and tighter exclusions. The HOA called it an unforeseen disaster. I called it a reminder. And that was only the beginning. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't come with shouting or fences or lawsuits. Sometimes it comes quietly, written in old ink, carried by water that remembers where it belongs. When people build without listening, the land eventually speaks. The morning after the flood, Silvercrest Bend looked abandoned. Mud-stained sidewalks traced the river's height. Furniture sat in broken piles. Drywall peeled like wet paper. That afternoon, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I went, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see how confidence looks when it has nowhere left to stand. Mark's shoes were still muddy. Engineers sat stiff with closed laptops. Homeowners filled every seat, anger buzzing under the hum of working HVAC. They blamed the weather, then the county, then an outdated dam no one knew about. Heads turned toward me. Mark accused me of acting irresponsibly and promised legal action. I stood slowly. I explained the recorded flood diversion agreement. The operating thresholds, the warnings they ignored. The room turned on the board faster than the river turned on the streets. Lawsuits followed. The HOA sued me. I countersued for trespass, environmental damage, and unlawful construction. Discovery exposed everything. Ignored reports, adjusted models, hidden disclosures. Home values collapsed. Insurance vanished. Special assessments crushed residents. Mark resigned. Board members followed. The HOA dissolved under debt. The court ruled I had acted exactly as required. Developers were reckless. Engineers settled quietly. Homes were condemned. Streets removed. Meadows restored. Watching houses fall felt inevitable, not victorious. By the second spring, Silvercrest Bend no longer existed. The river flowed quietly again. Years passed. The land remained. I donated part of the meadow as protected flood mitigation land. The rest I left open. No fences, no signs. Every spring, inspectors came. Fewer questions each year. The system worked because it guided water, not fought it. And one day I added a single line to my grandfather's notes. Respect the water. It always collects what it's owed. On a clear morning years later, I opened the gates just enough. Water spread gently across the meadow, harmless and controlled. No sirens, no headlines. That was the real victory. Some